There we go. So what I'm going to talk about today is go through two types of different observations we have. Some are from the ocean and the other lot are from simulations. So I'm going to talk you through these types of observations that we have. Then we're going to look at the near-bed turbulence and mixing processes that we've observed. And then we'll look at how we can characterise this more generally into a mixing layer height. And finally, some conclusions. So what is a boundary layer? Well, the boundary layer is just describing any thin layer of fluid that's directly influenced by the interface between the object and the fluid. So we have, we all live in our planetary boundary layer. There's boundary layers that are flowing around, our cars, our aeroplanes, etc. are always trying to minimise the amount of drag so that we can get the most fuel efficiency out of moving objects. And then there's also biological boundary layers. So, if we think about the blood flowing through our blood vessels, then there's a boundary layer at that interface. So there's just three examples. So we're going to focus on geophysical boundary layers, of course, here today. And in particular, it's of note that most of these geophysical boundary layers are very turbulent. So within the ocean, we have a boundary layer at the air-water interface. And then we also have boundary layers at the sediment interface. And we're going to focus on those bottom boundary layers. And we can have boundary layers that are quite small, that are forced by surface waves. We can have boundary layers that are forced by tidal type oscillatory forcing, and then we all the way up to boundary layers that are forced by balances with the Coriolis force. So in the ocean, we have these wide number of different range of scales that we can be looking at or are of interest. And we also are often dealing with stratified fluids. So how these boundary layers interact then with the stratified fluid above is a focus in this study. So boundary layers in the ocean, or bottom boundary layers in the ocean, are of importance because they are the region where a lot of the energy is dissipated from all types of flow. So they contribute a lot to this, loss of energy in the ocean. It's also the place where a lot of our infrastructure is located on the seabed. And so we need to understand the interaction of the currents with these structures to get the design right. It's responsible for, or plays a big role in sediment transport. So if we look at this image here on the right, we can see this brown is the sediment being resuspended under a nonlinear internal wave. So it's very important to any processes that are occurring across that interface, and also for things like transport of nutrients to organisms that are living close to the seabed. So today we're going to focus on these bottom boundary layers, and in particular in a stratified oscillatory environment. So we're going to look at the mechanisms responsible for mixing and how they change over that bottom mixing layer. So for example, as we move from the inertial log layer up into the capped pycnocline above it, where the stratification begins. And we're also going to look at what sets the mixing layer height and whether we can model that quite well for a stratified tidal bottom boundary layer. So just to kind of get you all into the same frame of mind for what this means in the ocean, I've just pulled out a little example temperature profile of the ocean. So we have, this is showing different months, so it's perhaps a bit more confusing than it needs to be. But if we focus just here on this one profile here, we see in the surface, we have this well-mixed layer, which is our surface boundary layer. And so obviously this is receiving a lot of energy from wind and surface waves. And then below that, we have stratification over this middle layer. So this decrease in temperature that's occurring. And then close to the bottom again, we tend to have a region which is well mixed, and the mixing in this, or the energy that's supplied to mix this region is supplied from the bottom stress, from a variety of different forcing. So it's this region here that we're going to look at today. And I've got this arrow here to indicate the flow is oscillatory. Otherwise, I wouldn't be invited to speak at this seminar, right? So how are we observing the bottom boundary layer? So the first set of observations is from large eddy simulations that were undertaken by Maddie. And so these are simulations that start to capture some of the small length scales, some of the turbulent length scales of the flow. And so these were set up to be driven with a pressure gradient that drives the flow at a set frequency, which we set to the tidal frequencies. And we could control also the amplitude as well as the stratification. And so she started these simulations with a stratification that was all the way towards the bed. And then after some time, the bed stress and then the resulting mixing above it led to the creation of this boundary layer. So we were focused then on the dynamics of the boundary layer. The other set of observations is from the field. So here we're taking measurements in 250 metres of water at a location on the Australian Northwest Shelf. And this region is very dynamic. It has a very strong surface tide. It also has a strong internal tide, which some of it is generated locally at the shelf break here, and some of it is generated over in Lombok Strait. And then we also get the development of highly nonlinear internal waves out of these internal tides in these regions. So this shows you kind of what our field setup looks like. We have these moored instruments spread over the entire water column, and we also have so this is a zoom in then of our moored instrument frame, so we can pick up what the temperature and the currents are doing over the entire water column. And then we also have this highly instrumented bottom mounted frame, which is taking observations very focused on the near bed. And so you can see in this simulation here, we have the evolution of some nonlinear internal waves on the shelf, just to demonstrate what types of dynamics these moorings are measuring. So when we're observing the bottom boundary layer, then we are picking up different types of dynamics in these field conditions. We have these very nonlinear internal waves where we have very large amplitude deviations of the isotherms. So the black lines here are showing you the isotherms of the temperature, and the black line here in the second panel is showing you the amplitude taken from modal fitting of these isotherms above. And so you can see in this first period, we have these very, very non-linear in our record, where we had slightly more linear internal waves. Of course, they're not perfectly sinusoidal or anything. We can still see that they have non-linear properties, but generally the amplitudes and the frequencies are much smaller than what we've seen previously. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the near-bed turbulence and mixing from these two sets of observations. So we'll start with the LES observations and then move to the field observations. I may be doing it around the other way, come to think of it. No, yes, we are starting with the field observations. So with the field observations, we just have some very detailed observations at a couple of points. above the bed. So we don't, this is why it's so nice to have the LES to kind of complement our observations, because we get much better resolution, obviously, with the LES. But what we can see here is a comparison of instruments that were placed about 0.5 metre above the bed, and below that at 1.4 metres above the bed. And we're just comparing here the shear production of turbulence to the dissipation of turbulent kinetic energy. And so if we remind ourselves of what the turbulent kinetic energy equation is comprised of, we say that the change in turbulent kinetic energy is the sum of the shear production of turbulence minus the dissipation, plus the buoyancy flux or buoyancy production, minus the turbulent transport. So we can see that in this region close to the bed, we have a close agreement of the production and dissipation, and this indicates that we're probably within the inertial subrange with this instrument. As we go further above the bed, we can see when we have very energetic flows that at this height, we're still within the inertial subrange, but as the energy decreases, then at this height, we start to be outside of the inertial subrange. So you can see that the inertial subrange is really quite confined to the bed in this bottom boundary layer. Now, one of the instruments that we had on the frame was this acoustic Doppler profiler, measuring just over the bottom 15 metres or so. And one of the measurements it makes is of the backscatter. So because it's very high frequency, it picks up the sediment in the water column and it samples at 16 hertz. So we get these beautiful images of the sediment in the water column. And if we zoom in, we can see then actually the coherent structures of the turbulence being picked up through, in this case, a nonlinear internal wave. So this is showing you, well, actually the black line here we'll look at is showing you the amplitude of the nonlinear internal wave. So you see it's very high frequency. It's happening over quite a short period in time. This scale is in hours here, and the blue line is showing you the associated near bed horizontal velocity. So we see this peak velocity occurring with the peak amplitude. So each of these lines is corresponding with the figures I'm going to show you below. So we see at time C here, this red line, just before the peak velocity, we have these structures that are quite confined to the near bed, so about 2.5 metres off the bed. And they're, if we zoom in, so this little box here, we can see that we have these elongated structures pushing out towards the ocean above it. And then a little bit later in our record, just past that maximum amplitude, we see these structures reaching higher above the bed, and this continues to evolve throughout this wave period until we have the concentration being equivalent over the entire bottom mixing layer. And so you can see how well these this backscatter instrument picks up some of these coherent turbulent eddies in its imaging. So in contrast, when we look at our LES results, we can see that things are a lot neater. We don't have so many processes going on. We're just trying to replicate a tidal shift in the stratified flow. So you can see here, for example, if we look at the friction velocity, which is this black line here, and we compare that to the turbulent kinetic energy, what we can see is that the turbulent kinetic energy is growing in each cycle to some maximum, and then as the boundary layer separates, it then decays again back towards the bed, and each cycle or half cycle, this is starting again. what is interesting is that we can see that the peak bed stress does not correspond to the highest vertical extent of this increased turbulent kinetic energy. Instead, it occurs just before we get boundary layer separation and just before the cycle recommences. And so this story is seen in more detail if we then look at the snapshots of what the turbulent kinetic energy looks like, instead of looking at these averaged images. So this is just looking at 4 different times within that half cycle. And we can see here at the beginning, we have the turbulent kinetic energy, large values confined very close to the bed. And then as the cycle evolves, this turbulent kinetic energy reaches up towards this region where we have our pycnocline. So this is our region of very strong stratification. And so you can see here, very similar to the image that we saw with the backscatter in the field, that the mixing, the effect of that bottom generated turbulence on the pycnocline is only occurring once this turbulent kinetic energy has mixed up to a height where it can actually start to interact with this bottom pycnocline. And then this pycnocline can actually be mixed with time. And so this can be summarized in this diagram here, where we're looking at cycle average quantities from our turbulent kinetic energy equation to look at the role of the different terms. So we see, as we could observe in the field data, that close to the bed, where our observations from the LES are well described by a balance between the dissipation in the red here and the shear production in the greens, and the other terms here are very close to 0. But as we move away from the bed and up towards our pycnocline region, which is this grey region shaded up above, that the turbulent transport term becomes increasingly important, and the importance of the shear production decreases. And this means that we no longer have this balance, and that the transport term is becoming increasingly important, and is fact very important in the pycnocline, as well as the buoyancy production also becomes important in this pycnocline region. So the significance of this is that we don't account for this turbulent transport in any of our models that allow us to take field observations, so the types of balances that we use when we want to calculate a buoyancy flux or a dissipation value in the field. A lot of the time require this assumption that we have a production dissipation balance. And it's also pretty rife in a lot of our turbulence schemes that we have in numerical models. This simplification occurs. And so what we're seeing here is this means that we're not going to get a good representation of how that boundary layer actually evolves over time, which you could see would be an important thing to get right in the ocean. So if we wanted to know, for example, how we should discretize an ocean model, so we actually resolved this bottom pycnocline, or if we wanted to take our own field observations and we wanted to make sure they're in the right place, then it would be good to know what this mixing layer height was likely to be. So first of all, in the field observations, we needed a way to actually characterize this mixing layer height. And what we decided was that the backscatter measurement was a good way of observing the mixing layer height, and we used a criteria for change in concentration, which allowed us to follow this mixing layer height over this extended 2-week period of data. Now, if you think about this, what we're characterising here is something very similar to where the pycnocline is sitting, but we're not tracking where the momentum boundary layer is growing up and collapsing again, like we saw in the LES data with the look at the turbulent kinetic energy. But we do have short periods of our record in the field where we could get better measurements of what that momentum boundary layer looks like. And I'll show you here just briefly what that looks like. So the pink line that's continuous here is showing you the height of the mixing layer that's taken from the backscatter instrument. So it's showing where the sediment extended to in the water column. Whereas the blue line here is showing you where the turning point in the velocity profiles were. So this is showing you the momentum boundary layer that grows in height with each of the tidal cycles and comes up to meet then the boundary layer, sorry, the mixing layer height, so the height where we see that pycnocline. And this is just showing you how we defined that turning point in a range of different example profiles here on the right. Now, when we go to the LES data, because we can control exactly the forcing and we can keep that forcing consistent over, in this case, 18 cycles of the tide, we can look in detail at what's happening. So this is just two different cases with different stratification. And you can see here the green is showing you where the mixing layer height is. So this dark green line that's here. And the black line is showing you the turbulent kinetic energy. And we can see that for different forcing and stratification, we have a different response, both in terms of the height of the mixing layer, but also the strength of the pycnocline. So we see these variations that are occurring. Whoops, I've gone the wrong direction. So how can we take all of our pieces of data together and come up with a model that describes the boundary layer? So we know that the turbulent Stokes boundary layer height in an oscillatory flow without density stratification scales like the friction velocity divided by the forcing frequency omega. And we know that when we have stratification controlled boundary layers, that they scale as the bed friction velocity divided by the buoyancy frequency n, which is the way that we classify the stratification. I probably should have said that earlier, but as I said, I'm used to talking to maybe a less diverse crowd. So what we see is that we have a boundary layer that's a function of the bed shear stress, the stratification, and also the forcing frequency. And so we took this model that was developed for Ekman boundary layers initially and replaced the Coriolis frequency with the forcing frequency of the tide in this equation, and tested it both with the LES data, which is the coloured triangles here, our own field observations, which are these crosses here, and the other circles and diamonds are taken from some lake observations where actually near inertial waves were was the forcing. And you can see that this model, this modified Weatherly and Martin model, does a pretty good job of predicting what the height of the boundary layer will be under these, quite a range of different conditions. And so this is very useful because it means then we can say, well, if we want to discretize our ocean circulation model appropriately so that we capture this this bottom mixed layer and the pycnocline above it, then we can use this model, or if we wanted to take more field observations, we can use this model to make sure we're getting the right resolution in our way that our instruments are set up. So in conclusion, we found that the bottom mixing layer thickness was a function of the stratification, the forcing frequency and the bed shear stress. And we determined a model across these two sets of different observations, as well as some other observations that allows us to predict what this height is. We found that the inertial sublayer, so that log layer, is confined to about 15% of the height of the total bottom mixing layer. So it's a relatively small portion of that overall bottom boundary layer. And importantly, we found that the mixing in the pycnocline is not being driven by the local shear, so not that shear production of turbulence, but it's actually being mixed by the turbulence that's created at the bed and then transported upwards from the bottom, and then works on that, increasing the height of that pycnocline. So these results will help us to design future observational studies. They'll also inform the vertical discretization of any ocean circulation models. And we've identified an issue with mixing parameterizations because we can see that there's not a balance in production, dissipation and buoyancy production. So we see that the turbulent transport term is important. And so this is something that needs a lot more work, but it's good that we know that we're not in the right place in terms of these mixing parameterizations, at least at these locations close to the bed. So if you're interested, you can have a look at a couple of published papers over the last couple of years, and then we're also preparing a paper based on the LES results that should be out sometime soon, hopefully. So thank you very much for your time, and I'd welcome any questions.
Thanks very much, Nicole. That was excellent. Yes, we have time for one or two questions. Please put your hands up, put your virtual hands up if you do have a question. Who have we got? Amin, you put your hand up.
Yeah, hi Nicole, hi. Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Actually, I'm quite interested in these coherent eddies which are formed. So were you able to identify a particular, quantify the forcing or the certification in order to observe these coherent structures appearing, and how many of them?
You mean in the field observations?
Maybe in the simulations, right? So I think field observations could be quite tough, right? So, yeah, but in the simulations generally, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess we haven't done a whole lot of work in trying to really characterize the coherent structures. We've more focused on characterizing, using the terms of the turbulent kinetic energy equation and looking at how that changes in time, as well as averaged over tidal cycles. But yeah, it is something that could be done, yeah. And I think it would be interesting.
Yeah. Especially in terms of transport, right? So I think it could be quite interesting. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks, Amin, for the question. Craig has a question as well, and then after that one, we'll move on to the final talk. Craig, hi.
Yeah, Kira, thanks, Nicole. Great talk. Just a question around Coriolis. I mean, you had the relationship where you replaced the Coriolis frequency with the tidal forcing. Is there a situation where there's more of a balance? Can you move to a different sort of parameter regime?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, Craig. So yeah, certainly boundary layers can be dictated, and tidal boundary layers can be dictated by Coriolis in a stratified fluid as well. Because we are in this location on the northwest shelf, where we're only about 15 degrees south, Coriolis doesn't play a big role. But if we were to move this certainly to polar regions, then yes, certainly, and we would see a big difference in in a rotating tide system, then we see a big difference in the height of the boundary layer that's formed. So we're not, I guess the Northwest Shelf allows us to be in a somewhat of a simplified regime because the Coriolis is minimal, but certainly as we move away from the equator, the situation becomes more complicated. Maddie's been doing some simulations actually under ice, but looking boundary layers under ice in the polar regions where she's now included tidal forcing plus Coriolis. And indeed, she sees these variations. So yes, very interesting dynamics that we've been able to avoid on the Northwest Shelf, but yes, need to be understood better. And I think it's just amazing that we don't understand this already, right? Like this is
totally, yes.
When we started this work, we were like, no, it has to be there somewhere, and it really just doesn't exist. That understanding. It's seems like such a basic concept to me.
Yeah,